Welcome to What the Adaptation. I'm Rebecca, and this isn't going to be our usual long-form panel discussion that we often do on What the Adaptation. This is going to be a shorter video where I examine how the Wheel of Time TV show is adapting the concept of ta'veren from the Wheel of Time books. I'm going to try to make this as accessible as possible so you don't have to have read the Wheel of Time books in order to watch this video. I do recommend that you have seen the first season of the show because I am going to be talking about some things from the final episode which would spoil some things for you. I'm going to be talking about the concept of ta'veren as it is developed in the Wheel of Time books, but in a general way that wouldn't spoil anything if you haven't finished them. I'm intending this to be an examination of how you adapt something that's very conceptual, which you can explain in more depth and more easily in a book series, but which is harder to convey in a visual medium like a TV show. So what is a ta'veren? Not a simple question to answer, as you will see. It is something that a person can be, but in order to explain further, we have to back up a little bit and first look at just some of the basic world building in the Wheel of Time. In this series, the concept is that time is circular. It is a wheel, get it? So there are a series of 7 ages which repeat themselves in a cyclical fashion for eternity. Each time an age comes again, the major events of that age will occur again, but the details and specifics of how they play out will be different. There is a pattern to each age, and that pattern is made up of individual lives. People conceive of each human life as a thread in the tapestry of an age. So your life as an individual is woven into that larger pattern of an age. But generally speaking, you have a reasonable degree of freedom for what you do in your life. That can change when there is a ta'veren or more than one ta'veren involved. When the pattern needs to start shaping events in a particular direction, it will choose an individual thread or life to become ta'veren. That individual will then have a little less control over the direction their life takes because the pattern needs their life for a specific purpose. A ta'veren will also affect the lives or threads around them and start pulling people and events in different directions. A ta'veren affects the overall weaving of the pattern around them. What this means in a practical sense is that events which could occur, but that just left to probability or chance would be very unlikely to occur, can become much more likely around a ta'veren. So as an example, a person who might normally choose to just stay in the small town that they were raised in might be influenced by a ta'veren to leave their home and take their life in a different direction, and then that would have ripple effects. The stronger a ta'veren is, the greater the influence they can have on the weaving of the pattern around them. In book 1 of the series, we learn definitively that 3 of the main characters are ta'veren. We learn this mainly because other characters tell them that they are, and because they find themselves pursued by the shadow, which is some evidence to support that assertion. ta'veren are rare, and usually the only way you can tell that someone is ta'veren is by watching for unusual events that occur around this person. There is one other way, which is just as rare, and that is a talent that some people possess of seeing ta'veren. A person with this talent can look at someone who is ta'veren and see a glow around them. But usually, very few people can do this, so this is very uncommon. These 3 main characters who are ta'veren are the only confirmed characters to be ta'veren at all in the main series. Robert Jordan also stated at some point when he was alive that certain other characters he was asked about are not ta'veren, even though events do seem to shape themselves around some other characters as well. Now let's look at how the show is starting to introduce this concept. On the whole, if I have to sum up their approach, it would be to not explain anything too early, to wait until something becomes directly relevant to the plot before starting to explain it. They're trying to keep the exposition as light as possible here. As perhaps you can already tell from this video, there is some reason to do it this way. It's taken me several minutes of talking to explain this much of the concept, something that you would never want to do in a TV show because it would be so unnatural. So they're trying to parse things out a little bit, give us little bits of information as we need them, and hopefully let it evolve more naturally. In episode 1, we do hear the word ta'veren when Moiraine tells Lan that there are rumors of 4 ta'veren in the region known as the Two Rivers, which is one reason why they travel there in their search for the Dragon Reborn. It's a pretty good assumption that in addition to being a very powerful channeler, the Dragon Reborn will also be a ta'veren. If you were just watching at that point, having never read the books, you'd probably take note of an unusual word that you did not know the meaning of because Moiraine does not explain it here. But so far, nothing unusual there. Shows often do this, where they'll introduce a word, not explain it, just kind of put it in your mind to come back to later when it will make more sense. Knowing what I explained about how this works in the books, it doesn't really make sense for there to be rumors about 4 ta'veren specifically. If you had 4 ta'veren that lived in the same village and unusual events were occurring around them, you might be able to tell that there was at least 1 ta'veren, but how would you be able to separate out that there were 4 specifically, unless you had the ability to see ta'veren or you separate out these 4 people, take them in different directions and see how events shape themselves around them or not under those circumstances. So Moiraine has apparently heard rumors that there are 4 of them. There's not really a good explanation for how that would be possible. But at this point in the show, we don't know anything about that yet. So there's nothing standing out here unless you're a book reader who knows more about this. And we should also remember that concepts like this are not developed in a vacuum. It needs to be incorporated into the overall needs of the narrative. The show also needs for Moiraine to find 4 characters and convince them to leave their village with her by the end of this episode. Adding in that specific number might help facilitate that. It may make more sense just in the context of this episode. Because it is so far unexplained in the show, we're able to just kind of accept that maybe Moiraine knows some different things in this version of the story than she did in the book version of the story. And it might bother book readers only at this point. I'll admit, I do kind of wish they had been able to just leave it unspecified, as just there are rumors of ta'veren in the Two Rivers. That would make more sense to me. But for all I know, they did it that way, and with test audiences found that there was some confusion, and by adding in that number, maybe there was less confusion. So we really have to put it in the context of the show too. The show then doesn't mention the word ta'veren again until the 8th and final episode of the season. It shifts to instead focusing on these ta'veren characters as potential candidates for the Dragon Reborn. We are then later asked to also consider characters like Logain and Nynaeve as potential candidates for the Dragon Reborn because they are very powerful channelers, something Moiraine also knows the Dragon Reborn must be, even though these characters are also a little older than she believes the Dragon Reborn to be. I suspect that by the finale, a lot of viewers will have forgotten they ever heard the word ta'veren when we finally hear it mentioned again. This time, Padan Fain tells Perrin that he is ta'veren, one of not 4, but 5 who are from the Two Rivers. Although Padan Fain doesn't name them specifically, it's clear that he's talking about Perrin, Mat, Egwene, Nynaeve, and of course Rand are all ta'veren in the show. He mentions how rare that is, that there might usually be just one in an entire generation. Fain says that being ta'veren means they are focal points for the pattern, giving that little bit of explanation for what ta'veren means. He goes on to say that Rand may be the Dragon Reborn, but they all have a part to play in the epic conflict to come. Fain also mentions the idea of balance, and although I believe part of what he says is simply his own opinion, not specifically to do with ta'veren, it's worth mentioning. Fain believes that the need for balance means that some of them, or maybe all of them, would turn to the shadow. I don't think there's anything to do with the nature of being ta'veren that would affect whether they would turn to the shadow or not. I think that is an entirely separate question, but he is right about the need for balance. ta'veren are a tool of the pattern, and the pattern is about balance. It is neither good nor evil. Likewise, the effects of ta'veren are neither good nor evil. There can be positive effects for people who are affected by ta'veren, and there can be negative consequences for others. Ultimately, it is neutral. So I want to look at the 2 major choices the show made in adapting this concept of ta'veren. 1, they decided to explain as little as they needed to. Thus, we get 1 mention of the word in episode 1 and a brief explanation in episode 8. I am slightly mixed on this decision. On the one hand, I wonder if there was some missed opportunity to mention it with a brief explanation, maybe somewhere in the middle. It might have allowed the audience to come out of season 1 with a little bit more understanding of the concept. The obvious place to do that would have been through the character of Loial, which is where we get a lot of the info in book 1 as well. Loial is a character who tends to expound upon things just by his nature, so he's very useful for exposition in that way. I can understand why they didn't put it in the scene he has with Rand in the library. They probably are being careful not to bring too much attention to Rand before they are ready to reveal that he is the dragon. I believe there were at least a couple of other Loial scenes that were cut, one in episode 5 between him and Nynaeve in the White Tower, and one in episode 6 between him and Moiraine. I do wonder if either of those might have been an opportunity to bring up the idea of ta'veren. But despite all that, the main point that I want to come back to is that we don't really need to know anything about ta'veren to understand the events of season 1. Everything that we see can also be understood through the lens of all these characters being potential candidates for the Dragon Reborn as well. It really isn't until books 2 and 3 that we start to see some unusual effects of ta'veren on the pattern. And that's something we might see in season 2, at which point we would then need more of an explanation for what exactly is ta'veren. So they're choosing to hold off and not drop more knowledge than necessary, knowing that it might be difficult for an audience to retain. Ultimately, I cannot really argue with that decision. As book readers, we tend to get anxious, thinking, oh, this hasn't been explained yet. Are they going to explain this? Is this going to get changed or cut? Forgetting that we didn't understand everything right from the beginning of reading this series either. It takes time to build up this base of knowledge in a series this size. The second decision made was to make all 5 of the main characters from the Two Rivers ta'veren instead of just 3. And with this decision, I'm fully on board. It never really makes total sense to me that Egwene and Nynaeve are not considered ta'veren in the books, given the way events also shape themselves around those characters. Certainly they are of equal importance to the narrative overall, as are Mat and Perrin. Rand might be slightly more important than anyone else just by nature of being the Dragon Reborn, but the books also make it very clear that it is not just about him. This is a huge, expansive world and narrative. And by choosing to take 3 of these characters and say they are ta'veren and not the others, it does kind of indicate that those 3 are on a different level of importance. And yet the narrative really doesn't support making that kind of distinction. Also, the fact that it happens to be 3 male characters who are ta'veren in the books and no female characters kind of creates a gender divide that I don't think was intentional. In the first book, it focuses on Rand and Mat and Perrin being ta'veren as a reason why Moiraine is interested in them, why the Shadow is interested in them, and it disguises the fact that Moiraine is specifically suspecting that one of the 3 of them is the Dragon Reborn. By flipping that in the show, it allows them to more clearly establish that all 5 of these characters are going to be pretty equally important in the overall narrative, which I think is pretty accurate when you consider the series as a whole. It's also important to remember that the books establish that it is possible to be more strongly ta'veren or less strongly ta'veren, and that there are multiple ways that the effects of ta'veren manifest. So that leaves plenty of options for how the show can explore the way it works for these 5 different characters, what it means for each of them to be ta'veren. They're not tied to doing anything in any particular way just by establishing that each of these 5 characters is ta'veren. Finally, some book fans argue that by making a character ta'veren in the show who is not ta'veren in the books, it somehow takes away from the accomplishments that she achieved on her own. And I think this shows a basic misunderstanding of what it means to be ta'veren, because there are disadvantages to it as well as advantages. And I never hear anyone arguing that any of the male characters who are ta'veren don't deserve credit for the things that they accomplish because they're ta'veren. So I don't think this undermines anything whatsoever, and I'm really interested in seeing how they will explore what it means to be ta'veren for 5 different characters now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave me a thumbs up and a subscribe if you do, and if you want to hear more of me and my co-hosts discussing these kinds of changes in adaptations.